Hello everyone, welcome back to Too Sweet MTG, welcome to another Commander video. Today we're going to be looking at a Commander deck I've gone out and built myself. This might actually be my new favourite deck. Today we're going to be looking at my Shadow Matters deck. Right, so here's the deck list. Let me tell you a little bit about this deck. So I wanted to build a deck around the mechanic Shadow. So Shadow, for those unaware, is a very old ability. It's kind of a different way of doing evasion. I'll read out Shadow for you now if you've never seen it before. So if a creature has Shadow, it means this creature can block or be blocked only by creatures with Shadow. So it's kind of like a super flying, as it were. So you might be wondering, why did I want to build a deck around this mechanic? Well, the reason for that is because all the cards are really old and really, really cool. Just like, look at these lads, look at these creatures we have. We have things like Dothy Cutthroat, Dothy Ghoul, Dothy Horror, Dothy Jackal. They all look sick. And these are all cards I remember as a kid really liking and thinking they were cool. And kind of the point of Commander is being able to do cool things like this. One issue with building a deck around shadow creatures is that what you may notice is that most of them don't even share a creature type, they only share an ability. And also there's only a few cards that actually reward you for playing things with Shadow. So Dothy Ghoul can get bigger whenever a creature with Shadow dies, or you have a card like Stronghold Overseer. This has a kind of a weird fire-breathing effect for all your shadow creatures. Now, I'm very much aware I could replace all these shadow creatures with, like, boring creatures that are just unblockable. But where's the fun in that? These cards are way more vibey and I like them. So while they might not share a creature type, what they do share is an ability. They share the ability to be unblockable. There is a ton of cool effects out there that reward you for dealing combat damage. So realistically, that is actually the theme of the deck. The actual core nuts and bolts of the deck, the thing that actually makes it playable and makes it good, is cards that reward you for dealing combat damage. So in the deck we have things like Coastal Piracy. These are things that reward us for dealing combat damage to a player. In the case of Coastal Piracy, it's by drawing cards. I will go through the whole deck in a little bit. An important place to start is with the Commander, because for this deck we have chosen the Ever-Changing Dane. It is Esper for a 3/3 legendary creature shapeshifter. It has pay a generic and sacrifice another creature. The Ever-Changing Dane becomes a copy of the sacrificed creature, except it has this ability. So why did we pick the Ever-Changing Dane as the commander of this deck? Well, I'm going to be honest with you, similarly to these cards, we've kind of picked it on vibes. And by that I mean the artwork looks cool, it kind of fits in with these kind of cards. The real reason, if I'm honest with you, is because we needed a commander in Esper. All of the shadow creatures, apart from like one Boros one, are in Esper. That meant we needed access to these colours, that meant we were playing a commander that was in Esper. You could definitely replace it with something like Rafine, but I kind of think the Ever-Changing Dane is cooler. And that is important in Commander. The ability on the Ever-Changing Dane does come up a little bit in the deck, and I'll pick out the cards that work well with it when they come up. Because for the rest of the deck, the game plan is to get a board state of shadow creatures, and then run a bunch of effects that reward us for dealing combat damage to a player, swing through with the shadow creatures, and profit. So I'll quickly skim over the shadow creatures now. You can see that we're running 22 of them. This is not all of them in these colours. You might notice as well that there's one very good one missing. We're not running Dothy Voidwalker because I only have one copy and it's in my cube. Basically in this deck, if it's less than 3 mana and has Shadow, we're probably running it. We do have some cards with some nice utility, so Dothy Cutthroat can destroy a creature with Shadow. We have Dothy Trapper that can give a creature Shadow. That's a nice little combination there. We have Looteral Core for a bit of card selection. We have Soltari Champion, which is actually kind of a win condition because it buffs up all of our creatures when it attacks. We have Soltari Visionary for some nice enchantment removal. And we even get a new card. We get Vashta Narada from the Doctor Who set, which I actually think is a really cool card. Especially in Commander, this is just going to sit there surviving all the board wipes and get huge. There are other shadow creatures out there. I'm not running the bad ones, and by bad I mean just expensive. These creatures are all in the deck because they are cheap and evasive. Having 22 of them in the deck definitely seemed like the right number. From playtesting, it means that we are definitely going to have access to them all throughout the game. One thing about Shadow, and having a bunch of creatures in our deck have Shadow, it means we're not really going to be able to block that much. Because Shadow creatures, unfortunately, can only block creatures with Shadow, they can't block regular creatures. So Dothy Trapper does double duty as it lets us block a creature, which is one reason why the protection section is also a little bit bigger. It's one of the weird things you have to consider when you're building a bit of a weird deck like this. So it's why I'm also running Dothy Embrace. I think this is actually quite a cool commander card because it can just make a creature that's attacking an opponent unblockable. But also in this deck, it lets us give our opponent's creatures Shadow so we can block them. But it's also why we're running cards like No Mercy. I really love this card. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, destroy it. Yes, our opponents can attack us, but their creature will die. Hooray, we love that. We also have Ophiomancer, is just going to spit out blockers every turn. That is also great. And we have Weeping Angel, another cool card that I want to play more with. They just incentivize players not to attack us. Because most of our deck can't block, we have a couple of really cool blockers with things like the Weeping Angel here. The rest of the protection is kind of generic. We have an Offer You Can't Refuse just to stop board wipes once we have that board state. And we have a card like Selfless Spirit to give our creatures protection, again so that they survive. That section is a little bit weird. That's one of the reasons why I spoke about it earlier in the video than I normally would. Let's go on to our card draw. This is definitely a section that gets the most out of these shadow creatures. So we're running things like Bind of Thassa, Coastal Piracy, Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and Reconnaissance Mission. Cards like these are all awesome in decks with unblockable creatures. You see them in like Edric Flying Men decks, those kind of things, because it basically turns each creature that we have into card draw every turn. So we're literally running every one of these that I own. I think there is a boat from a recent set that I don't have, but otherwise it would be in here. On top of that, there's also some cool things that work really well with unblockable creatures. Things like the Monarchy is fantastic with a load of unblockable creatures. We're always going to be able to get it back and draw a card. Yes, our opponents will take it. Who cares? We will get the card draw, and that's what the deck really wants. Same with the Initiative. Again, our creatures are unblockable. We'll always get the initiative back on our turn. On top of those, we have some cool cards like Kaito Shizuki. With this, we're effectively guaranteed to draw an extra card every turn. And then it has a cool ultimate that could win us the game. We love that. You also have Dovin Grand Arbiter. This scales really nicely in decks that can deal a bunch of combat damage to a player. Can also make us a blocker as well. We love that. I could probably do with some cheaper card selection in here, but there's a lot of cool cards I wanted to jam in, so these are the 8 bits of card draw that we went with. Our ramp is also pretty standard. On top of Wayfarer's Bauble, we have Arcane Signet, we have Sol Ring, and then we have a Signet in each colour, along with a Felwar Stone. Just making our colours of mana is very important. While it says only 7 bits of ramp in the deck, there is an 8th bit in the win-con section that I'll get onto a little bit later. Let's talk about our interaction section next. Things like Anguished Unmaking, things like Damn, things like Day of Judgment, Infernal Grasp, and Snuff Out are all just very good, solid bits of interaction. You could see these in any deck, they're pretty straightforward. I don't know what Sword of Hearth and Home is doing in the interaction section. That should probably be in ramp. Let's quickly change that. You did not see a thing. But on top of these generically good bits, we can also run some cool bits of interaction. Things like Battles work really well in decks when you have a load of unblockable creatures. Like we're running Invasion of Innistrad. It gives a creature -13/-13 until end of turn. Getting on Indestructible is very nice, but also it's a battle that we can easily attack and flip. We also have Elspeth Sun's Champion. Again, this can gum up the board with a load of blockers, but also it can come down and be a board wipe straight away. Most of our creatures aren't going to have power 4 or greater in this deck, so it's really good at taking out any big threats that our opponents might have put down. And then also it has an emblem that'll help us win the game. We love that. And while this interaction section might look a little bit small, 7 is quite light. That is on top of cards like Soltari Visionary. It is some repeatable interaction for enchantments. On top of the cards like Dothy Jackal and Dothy Cutthroat, which are kind of like half a bit of interaction. They need things to kind of click for them to actually work. But we are in a decent place with those. Some recursion, we first have Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. This is a cool card that can mine us to bring a cheap creature back from our graveyard into play, while also giving our creatures lifelink when we're attacking, which will be very nice. Same with Whip of Erebos. My thinking was because we can't really block, we can gain some life back from all the attacking that we're doing. With Ever-Changing Dane, again, let's just bring back a creature one time for a turn. Let's move on to our win cons, because that's kind of where the deck gets really cool. So that bonus bit of ramp I mentioned earlier is Strixhaven Stadium. This is 3 generic for an artifact that has tap, add a generic, and put a point counter on Strixhaven Stadium. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, remove a point counter from the stadium. But whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, put a point counter on Strixhaven Stadium. Then if it has 10 or more point counters on it, remove them all, and that player loses the game. This is very cool in a deck with all these unblockable creatures. Effectively, if we play this and then attack them with 10 creatures, our opponents just lose the game. That's pretty powerful on a perfectly fine manolith. It can be ramp, but also it can be a very cool win con as well. In fact, I think it's so cool, we're also running Moon Silver Key as a way of going and finding it. Because it taps for mana, it has a mana ability, Moon Silver Key can go and get it. All of the win cons in some way work really well with unblockable creatures. So we have cards like Drana Liberator of Malakir, Ethereal Absolution, the emblem of Gideon Ally of Zendikar, Necropolis Regent, and again the other emblem of Sorin Lord of Innistrad. They're all ways of buffing up our creatures. I tried to run as many emblem makers in this as possible because they're effects that will always stick around. So it doesn't matter if our board gets wiped, we can slowly rebuild and we still have these buff effects always in play. There's a couple of cute cards in here which might not be the most optimal, but I think they're really fun. First we have Stolen Identity. This is a 6 mana clone effect, which I will admit is quite expensive, but importantly it also has Cypher. That is a bit of a weird ability that lets you exile it under a creature that you control. When that creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to cast this spell again, and then again and again and again each time you deal combat damage to a player. Putting this on one of our unblockable shadow creatures is awesome. You just get to permanently make the best creature on the board. When I played with this, I've just made my opponent's commanders and I've started beating them with copies of them. That is very good and very fun. Another card that's a little bit all in is Elbrus the Binding Blade. It is 7 generic mana for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0. That's not great. But it also has, when equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, unattach it and then transform it. It transforms into Withengar Unbound, which is a 13/13 demon with flying, intimidate, and trample. And whenever an opponent loses the game, put 13 +1 on counters onto it. Now I know there's probably better things that you could run in this slot, but this card is really cool. As this is already a bit of a Vibes Matters deck, this just fits in great. Then lastly, we have Hatred. Hatred is an inclusion that works really well with the commander. Because the Ever-Changing Dane can become a copy of a creature we control, we can basically make it a shadow creature. That means our commander is unblockable. We can swing through, we can cast Hatred, we can pay 21 life or however much we need to just take out a player in one swing. That's our main win con section, but we have this other little package that I want to talk about. It's over here, it's labelled Omniscience package. And I put this in here because this does work really well with our commander. The thing about the Ever-Changing Dane is that effectively, it is a sacrifice outlet. At its base level, you can pay a mana to sacrifice a creature you control. There is one very powerful creature that really wants to die, and that's Academy Rector. This is not required, but I own one and I thought it was cool. Basically, Academy Rector is 4 mana for a creature that says when it dies, you get to cheat an enchantment from your library into play. So to be fair, you could just go and get a reconnaissance mission or something like this and draw a bucket load of cards. That is very, very strong. The other thing you can do, if you already have a bit of a grip, is go and cheat an Omniscience. It's going to cheat an Omniscience into play. This is a beefy 10 mana spell that says you can cast non-land cards from your hand without paying their mana costs. It is very unlikely we hardcast this in this deck. But if we see the Academy Rector, then it is something we can do for some additional space. This is a deck that's trying to win by beating down with 1/1s and 2/2s, that kind of thing. Having this little release valve win con thing, I think is pretty cool. And the fact that the Ever-Changing Dane becomes a copy of the creature that you've sacked means that if you sack the Academy Rector, you can technically go and get Reconnaissance Mission or something like it, swing through with all your creatures, draw a load of cards, draw a removal spell. You can then point that at your commander, which remember is a copy of Academy Rector. You then get a second one of those, and that's when you get the Omniscience, and that's when you cheat everything into play. That is very much Magical Christmas Land, but by God it is cool. The rest of the deck is very simple. The utility lands is only Bojuka Bog, Maze of Shadows, which is a Maze of Ith if we can give one of our opponent's creatures Shadow. As we all know, there's a couple of ways of doing it in the deck. We might as well run it. I mean, where else can you run Maze of Shadows in a commander deck? And then we have Takenuma Abandoned Maya because I owned a spare one. The rest of the lands are very much just here for fixing. We are a 3-color deck, we can't run too many utility lands. So I'm going to be honest, I really, really enjoy playing this deck. Is it the strongest deck I own? Definitely not. But it's a very fun deck with a lot of cool and interesting lines. I'm really finding myself liking decks that don't super revolve around the commander. We could spend games in this deck never casting the Ever-Changing Dane. Or we could draw an Academy Rector, or we could draw a Hatred, and use it to win the game really impactfully. I can almost guarantee this is the only Ever-Changing Dane deck out there that is built around Shadow Matters. But one of the cool things I like about building a deck with some kind of restriction, in this deck it's using a bunch of shadow creatures. That is definitely a restriction. Is that it leads you down some cool interesting paths of finding cards that work really well with them. Like I definitely looked at Strixhaven Stadium when that card got printed. But it wasn't until I was thinking about it in this deck that it really started to shine to me. A bunch of the things in this deck will definitely see play in other decks that care about creatures dealing combat damage. I mean, we just saw a Sultai commander get printed in the Outlaws of Thunder Junction that literally rewards you for that. Like all the black and blue cards in this deck could very easily just transfer into that deck. Maybe not the shadow ones, that's up to you. Things like battles are really cool with unblockable creatures, because you know you're going to be able to flip them because your creatures are unblockable. Things like the Monarchy, things like the Initiative also work really well in those kind of decks. There's definitely a more tuned version where I run more or less of these effects. Because I found so many different cool ones, I kind of wanted a little sprinkling of them all. But to me, I really love this deck and I think it's really cool. A link to the deck list will be down in the description below, but there's definitely changes you can make to this. Like the most expensive cards in the deck will definitely be this little Omniscience package down here that you don't need to run. It's me being a bit stupid. Same with a card like Hatred. I think mine's actually gold border, so it's way cheaper than this one. One of the nicest parts is that all the shadow creatures, apart from the Voidwalker that I don't have a spare of, are really super cheap. And that was one of the nice things about putting this deck together, is that a fifth of it is all super, super cheap. Again, these could just be like Baleful Strixes and Slitherblades, and the deck would still work pretty well. And what's nice as well is that you are going to get to see this deck in action. In a couple of days at time of recording, we're going to be recording our first episode for Commander gameplay on this channel. 4 players in person, dueling it out with Commander, and this is the deck that I'm going to be running. It's played pretty well when I played it in the past, let's see how it does on camera. If that sounds good to you, or if you'd like the look of this deck, please consider subscribing to the channel, it would greatly help me out. But until next time, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.